Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes and welcome to Books My Dad, who was a PhD in English literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature, also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature. Hey, look at that, another book that I don't know anything about and am going to have to talk about because I'm just a nut. So for the record, yes, I know many people really think John Dos Passos is great. That was the book that my mother liked from last week, but we're not talking about books my mother liked. We're talking about a book that my father thinks that people who are well-read or well-educated should probably have read. Or rather, ought to. Whether or not they're likely to is another issue. So, let's go for it. John Steinbeck's Dubious Battle, which was apparently now a major motion picture at the time that this book was released. Anyways, so here's the thing. John Steinbeck, obviously best known for Of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath. Both books that I read in school and both books that I know I absolutely remember virtually nothing from. I read a lot of books in school that I don't remember anything from because I'm very good at reading a book and if I don't like it, making myself not remember it ever again. This is, of course, a problem years later when I'm trying to talk intelligently about, smart books. So, Dubious Battle is a much earlier book by John Steinbeck, and it's a book that is therefore a lot blunter. Grapes of Wrath is a very long read, and it's very much about the plight of the everyman in a world where rich people aren't going to give him a fair shake, and that sort of thing. Dubious Battle is very much blunter about what's going on in the course of these labor fights that went on early in the 20th century with first people like the IWW, Knights of Labor, that you had these people who desperately that they were going on strikes in a bid to get living wages, in a bid to be allowed to have a rational length of working day. All that kind of stuff that in a lot of ways we take for granted these days. And this book is very blunt about exactly how awful people on both sides are. Because, yes, of course, the landowners who cut wages to the bones and relied on the fact that these people were desperate for money and would work for them anyways, even though they weren't paying enough, because they couldn't get anything anywhere else, that you have those people. And they are awful. They're awful with their calling in scabs in order to break a strike. They're awful with making sure that the police will hunt people down and shoot them. They're awful by setting up citizens' bands to, having regular citizens come together to shoot people. All of those kinds of things, it's awful. But one of the going threads throughout this book is that there are some people on the labor side of it who aren't plaster saints either. That you have Mac, who sort of is the guy who introduces Jim to everything, who takes him through stuff, who walks him through everything. And Mac is always talking about how, man, I wish somebody would get hurt because we need to use that to rile people up. Mac is very cold and very calculating and very determined, and he's one of those people who forces himself to always see the bigger picture and never ever worry about the smaller picture, because that's always the problem. Is you look at the big picture, you look at the movement of troops, you look at the movement of everything overall, and you forget that there are ordinary people on the ground dying. And Mac is very, very caught up in that because he desperately wants there to be, a world in which all of these people can, live in peace and work and just do their jobs and get proper compensation for their work and so on and so forth. But he's so busy with that he loses track of the small things. And over the course of the book, you have Jim, who starts out as this fresh-faced young man who really wants to believe in something and join something, and it's like he's been inculcated into a cult. And it's very much like that old saw about how the converts are always the strongest believers are always the most slavish adherents to their new dogma. And of course that's because the reason to convert is because you believe in something, because why would you convert if you didn't believe in it? And Jim, by the end of this book, has gotten just a little frightening. He's turned dogmatic and obsessive. And in the foreword to this book, there's this whole thing about him finding his path and manhood and everything else. And frankly, I don't really see it as that. I see it as somebody who wanted something because he saw how his father was ground down by things and spent so much time in the midst of everything that he lost track of his reason being his father and turned it into the movement. The problem is, of course, that you have to balance these things, because when you stop seeing people and just start seeing the movement, that's when you start treating people as not being people, and you become just as bad as the other side. Which is, of course, the other major theme in this, or rather, one of the primary themes in this has to do with the mob. Because this is a long-term psychological issue, something that's been discussed for decades now, is mob psychology. Because when you get a group of people together, and you have them all working and thinking and moving together in a group, when the mob mentality takes over, it's a very, very unusual psychological construction, because suddenly you have these people who are moving as a unit and aren't thinking like people anymore. They're thinking in a different group way. And it's a very, very strange thing. And it's the kind of thing that people have studied in terms of, you get large crowds of people together where somebody is about to commit suicide by jumping off a building, and suddenly you have this crowd of people chanting "jump," and there's no sane reason for it, because not one of those people would have actually wished this person ill. It's just something took hold of them and they started chanting it. And that's the thing, is that a lot of this book is it's about the well-nigh religious approach some people have to things like labor movements, but also the mob mentality, and the way that Mac is desperately trying to use mob mentality to push this strike to go on longer. And it's a cruel, horrible thing, because he goes into this saying, I don't think we can win this strike. I don't think we're going to win this strike, but we need to make them strike anyways, because we need to make more people strike, so that eventually we have everybody all across the US striking, so that we can get what we want. But he pushes all these people into it, even though you have all of these men who otherwise wouldn't have, and many of them wouldn't have been hurt, wouldn't have been shot, wouldn't have been arrested, wouldn't have many other things. But he takes advantage and pushes them into it. And it's not that this book is a hard read or a slow read or an uninteresting read, but by golly is it grim. And at the end of this book, Jim, who was transformed from somebody who wanted to believe in something, and who wanted to make sure that nobody ever turned out like his father, and to make sure he didn't turn out like his father, that you have this guy, And he's gone from that sort of fresh-eyed idealism, this sort of youthful idealism, into just this frothing at the mouth hard party line member who's determined to draw blood, who he gets shot partway through, when you have this scene where he's like, well, how about if I take off my bandage and bleed in front of the guys? Maybe that'll get them hyped up. And it's like, it's this horrifying descent. And while, again, I can applaud the labor movement, and I think that it did wonderful things, this book, among other things, is a very strident reminder about the fact that people who run these movements often become obsessed and become kind of horrifying caricatures of what they're trying to achieve. And so it's very, very difficult for me to put this into words, because it's kind of a religious fervor, and I don't want to really compare it to that, partly because I don't want to step into anything that's too controversial in terms of comparing religion to people frothing at the mouth to see blood. Anyways, I'm not really sure I have all that much else to say. I mean, I suppose I could talk more. I will say one thing about this edition. There's a very lengthy foreword in this book, which, among other things, informs the reader of the foreword that Jim dies at the end. So that was great. On the other hand, I've never really cared about spoilers, because my stance has always been, does it tell me how they died? Does it tell me where they died, when they died, or why they died? No, it just tells me that they died. Well, then, that didn't really give anything at all away. In any event, it's a very lengthy foreword, talking a lot about Steinbeck and what Steinbeck thought, and how he wasn't really quite one with the left wing, or things of that nature, to which it's one of those things that I look at and I think nobody should ever genuinely be 100% at one with any movement, because unless you are the actual specific person who's setting the agenda, in which case you really should agree with everything on your personal agenda. Otherwise, what are you doing? But otherwise, if you agree lockstep with every single thing, an agenda, a platform, a manifesto, or another person says, you're probably not actually thinking about it. Anyway, and so Steinbeck not being in 100% lockstep with any one given socio-political group doesn't really shock me, because I would hope that any well-known reader would not be in 100% lockstep with any given group, unless, as I said, they were the ones setting the manifesto. Anyway, I don't think I really have anything else to say on this. So that's just about everything, and I will see you all next week.